Shortly after midnight on September 26, 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was sitting in a bunker outside Moscow when the screen in front of him lit up with one word: launch. The computer said an American missile was heading for the Soviet Union. Then it said 4 more were coming behind it. Petrov had less than 15 minutes to decide whether to report a nuclear attack up the chain of command, a report that would very likely have triggered an immediate Soviet counterstrike. He did not report it as confirmed. We're coming back to exactly what happened next, and exactly how close the world came that night, later in this video. Because to understand why one man's judgment call in a Moscow bunker nearly decided the fate of the planet, you first have to understand the 100 years that built up to it. If you had to sum up the 20th century in one sentence, it might be this. It's the story of humanity getting steadily, terrifyingly better at destroying itself, decade after decade, while somehow, so far, managing not to use the worst of what it built. But that sentence badly undersells just how much else happened along the way. This is a century that rewired how long you live, how you talk to strangers on the other side of the planet, who gets to vote, who gets to rule themselves, and what an ordinary Tuesday even looks like. So let's actually walk through it, decade by decade, because the details matter more than any summary ever could. The 1900s, the opening decade. In January 1901, Queen Victoria died after 63 years on the British throne, and it genuinely felt to many people alive at the time like an entire era had ended with her. And in a sense, it had. In the year 1900, the average person on Earth could expect to live to about 32 years old. Not because everyone died young, but because so many children didn't survive early childhood at all, and infectious disease killed discriminately across every age group. There were no antibiotics yet. Germ theory was still a relatively new idea to most working doctors. A skinned knee, infected, could genuinely kill you. Most of the world's population still lived rurally, and most of the map was still colored in by empire. Britain, France, and a handful of other European powers directly controlled huge portions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Millions of families, meanwhile, were on the move. Massive waves of immigration were reshaping the United States, Canada, and Australia, as people fled poverty and persecution in Europe for the promise of land and work on the other side of an ocean. Then, in December 1903, 2 bicycle mechanics from Ohio named Orville and Wilbur Wright got a powered aircraft off the ground at Kitty Hawk for 12 seconds. 12 seconds. By the end of this century, humans would be routinely crossing oceans in the air in a matter of hours. In 1908, Henry Ford's Model T rolled off the line, and the automobile stopped being a rich person's novelty and started becoming something an ordinary family might actually own. The century's engine, quite literally, was starting to turn over. The 1910s. This is where the century's darker pattern first reveals itself, and it starts, oddly enough, with a ship everyone already thinks they know. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic, supposedly unsinkable, struck an iceberg and sank on its very first voyage, killing more than 1,500 people. A disaster that shattered a certain confidence in unstoppable human engineering, just 2 years before something far larger would shatter it completely. In June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off a chain of military alliances that pulled nearly every major world power into what became World War I. The first war fought with machine guns, tanks, and chemical weapons on a genuinely industrial scale. Soldiers spent years living in trenches, and the introduction of mustard gas as a battlefield weapon horrified even the generals who had ordered its use. In 1917, in the middle of all of this, the Russian Empire collapsed entirely. The Tsar was overthrown, and by the end of the year the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin had seized power, planting the seed of the exact Soviet state that would later build the arsenal Stanislav Petrov was guarding decades later. World War I itself killed an estimated 20 million people. But here's the twist almost nobody expects. The war wasn't even the deadliest thing to happen that decade, as soldiers packed into crowded trenches and troop ships carried them across the globe. A flu virus mutated into something far more lethal than any seasonal strain humanity had ever encountered. Estimates of the death toll from the 1918 pandemic vary enormously, anywhere from 17 million on the low end to as high as 100 million on the high end, because record-keeping in much of the world at the time was simply too poor to know for certain. What we do know is this: more people likely died from that flu in about 2 years than died across 4 full years of World War, and it hit a group nobody expected. Not primarily the very old or very young, but healthy adults in their 20s and 30s, the exact group flu pandemics usually spare. The 1920s. The world, exhausted, tried to move on, and mostly succeeded, at least on the surface. You may have seen our episode on 1926 specifically. The speakeasies, the jazz, the land speculation in Florida, radio becoming a household fixture for the first time. Women had just won full voting rights in the United States with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Following partial suffrage in Britain 2 years earlier. A genuinely radical shift in who got a say in how these countries were governed. Household electrification kept spreading through the decade, changing what an ordinary evening at home even looked like. In May 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic for the first time, and silent films gave way to talkies that same year. 1927's The Jazz Singer is usually credited as the film that proved audiences wanted sound alongside picture. It felt, for most of the decade, like the future had arrived early and was moving fast. But underneath the party, the centuries earlier debts hadn't actually been paid off. War reparations were still destabilizing European economies. Exactly the kind of pressure that helped spark Italy's Mussolini seizing tighter control of the military that same year, 1926. Financial speculation, meanwhile, was building on foundations far shakier than almost anyone wanted to admit. On October 29, 1929, a date now simply remembered as Black Tuesday, the U.S. stock market collapsed, wiping out fortunes in a matter of days and triggering the opening act of the next decade's defining crisis. The 1930s. This is the decade the party's hangover actually arrived, and it arrived hard. The Great Depression pushed U.S. unemployment above 24% at its worst point in 1933, roughly 1 in 4 working-age Americans without a job. Bank failures wiped out ordinary families' entire life savings overnight, since deposit insurance as we know it today simply didn't exist yet. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, launched in 1933, tried to rebuild the economy through massive public works programs and new financial regulations. In the American Midwest, a prolonged drought combined with poor farming practices created the Dust Bowl, turning millions of acres of farmland into literal moving walls of dust and displacing an estimated 2.5 million people from their land. And economic desperation, as it so often does, opened the door for strongman politics on a global scale. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, promising to restore the national pride and economic stability the Depression had stripped away. Within 2 years, the Nuremberg Laws stripped Jewish citizens of basic rights, an early and explicit step in a persecution that would escalate horrifically over the following decade. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's political purges were killing and imprisoning millions of his own citizens throughout the decade. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and in 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. A conflict historians often describe as a dress rehearsal for the larger war to come, with Germany and Italy testing weapons and tactics on Spanish soil. By the end of the 1930s, nearly every major power on Earth was rearming, and almost everyone could feel what was coming. The 1940s. And then it arrived. World War II began in Europe in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, and it eventually became the deadliest conflict in human history. Estimates range from 40 million to as high as 85 million deaths, depending on how you count famine and disease alongside direct combat, a genuinely enormous range that reflects just how chaotic and undocumented much of the death toll was, especially across Eastern Europe and Asia. During the war, the Nazi regime carried out the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others in the Holocaust, one of the deliberate, industrialized atrocities that define this decade as the darkest of the century. London endured months of nightly bombing during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. And the United States entered the war directly after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. D-Day in June 1944 opened the war's decisive Western Front, with Allied forces from the US, UK, and Canada landing together on the beaches of Normandy. But the truly century-defining moment came in August 1945, when the United States detonated the first, and to this day, the only nuclear weapons ever used in war, over Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, killing an estimated 140,000 people in Hiroshima and roughly 74,000 in Nagasaki by the end of that year alone. Humanity had just built something it could never fully unbuild. In the war's immediate aftermath, the United Nations was founded in October 1945, explicitly designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe from happening a third time, and in 1947, British India was partitioned into India and Pakistan, triggering one of the largest mass migrations in human history as millions of people crossed the new border in both directions. And in 1948, a new state of Israel was born after all the math of this decade. The question for the rest of the century became, now that atomic weapons exist, and now that empires are visibly starting to crack, what comes next? The 1950s answered the first half of that question by building more bombs. But if you'd been an ordinary person living through 1950 specifically, your experience of post-war recovery depended entirely on your geography, and this is worth sitting with for a moment. In American suburbs, 1950 was a genuine boom. Developments like Levittown, New York, sprang up practically overnight. Mass-produced, affordable housing that let working families buy their first home. Car ownership exploded. Television sets started appearing in living rooms for the first time. And a new, distinctly American vision of domestic comfort took shape almost overnight. Meanwhile, across much of Europe and large parts of Asia, 1950 still meant rationing. Some rationing in Britain didn't fully end until 1954, rebuilding bombed-out cities literally brick by brick, and years, sometimes over a decade, before anything resembling that American suburban comfort would exist for ordinary families there. Same year, same century, two almost unrecognizably different worlds. Underneath both of them, a very different kind of tension was building in the United States. A political climate of suspicion known as McCarthyism, where accusations of communist sympathy could end careers and reputations overnight, regardless of actual evidence. And in 1953, scientists James Watson and Francis Crick, building on X-ray imaging work by Rosalind Franklin, described the double helix structure of DNA, a discovery that would eventually reshape medicine itself decades later. In June 1950, meanwhile, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, becoming the first major, hot proxy conflict of a decades-long standoff between the United States and Soviet Union that would never quite become direct war between the two superpowers themselves, but came terrifyingly close more than once. The 1960s. This is arguably the most consequential 10 years of the entire century, and it's worth slowing down for. In October 1962, American reconnaissance discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world sat closer to nuclear war than at almost any other point in this century. And there's a lesser-known hero buried inside that crisis, worth mentioning here. Aboard a Soviet submarine near Cuba, an officer named Vasily Arkhipov alone refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo when his vessel came under depressurized, exhausting pressure from American depth charges, a decision that, like Petrov's 2 decades later, may have single-handedly prevented the crisis from turning into full nuclear war. A tense standoff and secret diplomatic back-channel eventually resolved the public crisis. The Soviets withdrew the missiles in exchange for a private U.S. commitment to remove missiles from Turkey, a deal the public didn't learn about for decades. At the same time, a very different kind of transformation was reshaping daily life at home. The birth control pill, approved for use in the U.S. in 1960, gave women unprecedented control over their own reproductive lives, contributing to a broader cultural shift often called the sexual revolution. The civil rights movement reached a defining peak with the March on Washington in August 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. addressed 250,000 people, a movement that would go on to reshape voting rights and dismantle legal segregation across the United States within just a few years. That same year, in November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, a moment of genuine collective shock across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia alike. And on July 20th, 1969, in the middle of all of this tension and transformation, humans walked on the moon for the first time. A Cold War space race that, for one brief, genuinely unifying moment, pointed all of that engineering ambition somewhere other than at each other. 1970s, the weapons kept coming. Through the 1970s, the world dealt with an oil crisis in 1973 that quadrupled prices in the US and UK almost overnight, reshaping everything from car design to household heating bills. The Vietnam War, deeply unpopular in the US and Canada alike, finally ended in 1975, with the fall of Saigon closing nearly 2 decades of conflict. Politically, the Watergate scandal forced President Nixon's resignation in 1974, a genuinely unprecedented moment of a sitting U.S. president leaving office in disgrace rather than finishing his term. Culturally, the decade swung between disco and punk, and a wave of decolonization continued across Africa, as dozens of former European colonies gained formal independence throughout the decade. Then, through the 1980s, even as personal computers began appearing in homes for the first time, the IBM PC launched in 1981. Two very different kinds of crisis emerged. In the United States, the CDC published its first report on a mysterious new illness in 1981 that would soon be identified as AIDS, a public health crisis that governments across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia were slow, and in many cases badly slow, to take seriously. And on the technological front, the underlying nuclear arms race that had defined the entire second half of the century kept climbing and climbing, until it peaked in 1986 at approximately 70,300 nuclear warheads worldwide, according to the Federation of American Scientists. Try to actually sit with that number for a second. 70,300 weapons, each one built to end cities, spread across the arsenals of a handful of countries, most of them aimed at each other, many of them on hair-trigger alert, ready to launch within minutes of an order from the top. That same year, 1986, a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded, releasing radioactive material across large parts of Europe. A stark, almost too perfect reminder, in the exact same year the world's warhead stockpile peaked, of what this technology could do even without anyone intending it. Which brings us back to Stanislav Petrov, in that Moscow bunker, in September 1983, 3 weeks after Soviet forces had shot down a civilian Korean Airlines flight, killing everyone aboard, and tensions between the two superpowers were about as high as they had been at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 decades earlier. The system in front of Petrov said American missiles were inbound. Protocol said he should report it immediately up the chain of command, and by most later analysis, if he had reported it exactly as the system presented it, as a confirmed launch, there's a real chance the Soviet leadership would have ordered a retaliatory strike before anyone had time to double-check. Petrov didn't report it as a confirmed attack. He reasoned that if the United States were actually launching a genuine first strike, it would involve far more than 5 missiles. A real attack would try to overwhelm Soviet defenses completely in one move, not trickle in one launch at a time in a way that practically invited a leisurely, confident counterstrike. He judged it a false alarm and waited for corroborating ground radar evidence that never arrived. Even as the system reported 4 additional missiles, he was right. Later investigation confirmed the satellite system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over Montana for missile launches. A weather pattern misread by a machine, on arguably the single most dangerous night of the Cold War's final decade. Petrov wasn't given a medal for it. He was quietly reprimanded for paperwork irregularities during the incident, and Soviet officials treated the entire event as a state secret for years, It only became widely known internationally well after the Cold War had already ended. He later said, simply, that he didn't know whether he should consider himself a hero. He was just doing his job, he said, the right person, in the right seat, at the right moment. And the 1990s closed the century out, in a way almost nobody would have predicted from inside 86's terrifying peak. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, ending the Cold War not with the nuclear exchange the entire century seemed to be building toward, but with a red flag simply being lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. That same year, a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee released the World Wide Web to the public, laying the groundwork for something that would reshape daily life more completely, in some ways, than anything since electricity itself. The 1990s also weren't free of tragedy. The decade saw the horrific Rwandan genocide in 1994, a reminder that the century's darkest instincts hadn't simply vanished with the Cold War's end. But that same year, 1994, also delivered one of the century's clearest moral turnarounds. Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa, formally ending decades of apartheid rule. And as the century wound down toward the year 2000, the world spent its final months gripped by genuine, widespread anxiety over the Y2K bug, a fear that computer systems worldwide, built decades earlier without accounting for a 4-digit year rolling over, might simply break at midnight. When the clock struck 12, almost nothing happened. It was, in its own strange way, a fitting note to close a century defined by building things powerful enough to end the world. And then, again and again, having them simply not go off. And here's what's worth sitting with as this video closes. The entire 20th century built, decade by decade, toward exactly the kind of moment Petrov faced. A century that started with 32-year global life expectancies and a 12-second flight ended with humanity holding the literal power to end itself many times over, and on at least one specific night. The only thing standing between ending and not ending was one mid-level officer's 15 minutes of judgment under almost unimaginable pressure. For viewers in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia specifically, none of this is distant history. It's the direct architecture of the world you're living in right now. NATO, formed in 1949 in direct response to the exact tensions this century built, still shapes foreign and defense policy across all 4 of your countries today. The Commonwealth relationships connecting the UK, Canada, and Australia were fundamentally reshaped by the wave of decolonization that accelerated through the second half of this century, as dozens of former colonies, India in 1947 and many African and Caribbean nations through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, gained independence and redrew the political map your grandparents grew up with. And the Cold War's symbolic end on November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down after nearly 3 decades dividing a city and a continent, reset the entire global order that the generation before you inherited, and that shaped the exact world you were actually born into. The 20th century didn't end with the bang that 100 years of escalation seemed to be building toward. It ended, instead, with a wall coming down, a flag being lowered, and a global stockpile that had peaked at over 70,000 warheads being slowly, deliberately reduced, down more than 80% by the early 2010. Not because the underlying danger vanished, it hadn't, and in some ways it hasn't even now, but because enough individual people in enough individual moments across 100 years, a submarine officer near Cuba in 1962, a bunker officer outside Moscow in 1983, made something close to the Soviet choice. To wait, to double-check, to not be the person who pulls the trigger on the worst possible outcome available to them. 100 years, 32-year life expectancies and a 12-second flight at the start. 70,300 nuclear warheads at the peak. Humans walking on the moon in the middle of it all almost as if to prove the century's ambition could point somewhere other than destruction. And one Tuesday night in September 1983, when the entire trajectory of everything that came before it came down to a single person, alone in a bunker, deciding not to act. That's the 20th century, and it's the exact 100 years that quietly built the world all of you. Watching this from the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia are living inside right now.